ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for being here. This is the Student Advisory Board of the Center for Politics and People helped plan this, and it's something that we have once a semester. My name is Lauren. I'm the current chair of the Student Advisory Board. Before you, we have 5 students here that are prepared to talk about North Korea and what steps the United States should take. We have several questions we're going to try and get through, and then after that, we'll move over to audience questioning. So the first question for our panelists is, what do we know and what do we not know about North Korea? And we're going to start here with Jacob Kramer.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kramer. I'm a class of 2019. So what do we know and what do we not know about North Korea? Well, we know that there's a lot of people dying in North Korea. There was a census done, or a study done by the U.S. Census Bureau from 1993 until 2008, talking about the amount of deaths going on in North Korea. And from 1993 to 2000, there was between 500 to 600,000 deaths due to famine, natural death, and also there were work camps and government executions. That was 2.3% of the population. We also know that between 2000 and 2008, there was an estimated 600,000 to 1 million people died from those above causes. And those deaths continue to grow each and every year. Not only are people dying, there's also mass human rights violations going on in North Korea. So I talked about those work camps. And currently, the current estimates is that there's about 200,000 people currently in those work camps. And if you read different things, people talk between work camps or death camps because they're pretty much both. They will work their people to death or sometimes just kill people. And these are massive human rights violations. They not only torture people, they do terrible things to their families. And these are all people who are considered enemies of the state. So they might not have done anything besides maybe talked about something against the government, said the wrong thing somewhere, or done something, and they're labeled enemies of the states. And not only they will be put in prison, but it's the generation above them and the generation below them that will also be put in prison. So we also know they have a nuclear weapon. Right now it appears that it can't be miniaturized, which is good, but they're still working on that technology.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Media. Thank you guys for taking time out of your day to come. So, going off of what JK said for his human rights violations, the North Korean system has what is called the Songbon caste system, and what that is there's 3 classes. There's the core class, which is your ruling class. You have your wavering class, which is the class in between. And then you have your hostile class. These are where these enemies of the state come in. And the hostile class is actually made up of around 20% of the population. And that's who's being targeted. There are members of the core class and there are members of the wavering class that are also being targeted. But the large majority of the groups that's being targeted are this lower class, this hostile class. And what I really focus on and what we know and what we don't know on that question is I focus on the nuclear program. So as far as we know, there are 4 steps to developing a deliverable nuclear weapon. The first step is you have to nuclearize. We know they've done that since 2006. The second step is develop an ICBM. We know they've done that since 2017. What we don't know is the following 2 steps. And we don't know if they've miniaturized a nuclear weapon. The intelligence so far has been disputed. And then the final stage is you have to be able to miniaturize that weapon, and then you have to be able to fit it on an ICBM. And of course, if they haven't done the 3rd part, then they haven't done the 4th part. So as far as what we know and what we don't know, they're on step 2, working on step 3.
Hi, I'm Kim Frisk. I'm class of 2019, and I kind of focused here on international relations and what we know about how the United States has been interacting with North Korea based on negotiations and the fact that that has been partially on the table with North Korea along with South Korea as well. Since post-Korean War, there has not been a peace treaty signed whatsoever. We're still in a ceasefire from 1953. So that's definitely something that's still on the table, but due to the rhetoric that's been going on throughout the United States, against North Korea, that's definitely something that is kind of tricky, I'll say for now. Other than that, there's been, obviously, as the gentleman before me has stated, different nuclear tests that have been going on in North Korea. And just the one little thing that I would like to throw out for everyone's knowledge is the ballistic missile that North Korea fired over Japan and landing into the Pacific Ocean within the last month or so.
Hi there, my name is Dakota Marlega, class of 2021. Just to sort of reiterate some of the points that have already been made in regards to the North Korean nuclear program and the knowledge that the United States has on it, we do know that they have a variety of missiles based on both successful and unsuccessful tests that they've run. We do know that it is disputed and it's not necessarily known whether or not they have a nuclear warhead small enough to fit on a missile. Some other things that the United States is not entirely clear on, the power or exact number of nukes in their possession. We do know they are not nearly as multitudinous or powerful as those possessed by other nations. Additionally, the reliability of the nuclear arsenal is also questionable.
Hi, I'm Eric Osmondson, class of 2021. So I'd like to focus a little bit more on the North Korean nuclear programs. I think the state of North Korea has been sufficiently covered by the other panelists. So I'd like to state that some of the intelligence community believe that North Korea may already have a nuclear-capable ICBM, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, General Joseph Dunford, and the former acting director of the CIA, Michael Morrell. And even if they don't, that reality appears to be fast approaching. An article published in the Washington Examiner on September 27, 2017 states that, quote, Dunford said there was consensus among senior Defense Department leadership that North Korea will soon perfect its missile technology and will have reliable and fully developed long-range nuclear weapons by late 2018. So considering this, we should prepare for any action against North Korea as if this were true.
So the next question, because this topic was brought up multiple times amongst the panelists, and this is open for anyone to answer, what steps should the United States take to deter the development of North Korea's nuclear program? Anyone can go.
Yeah, so we've tried a lot of steps, but unfortunately failed. We've tried diplomacy. They still haven't ceased their nuclear programs. We've tried incentives through humanitarian aid. They still haven't done so. And not only have they not given that humanitarian aid to the people that need it, they've been using it for the core class. They've been using it for the people that already have food on their plate. And then finally, we've tried sanctions and failed. And there are three problems that I have with sanctions. The first is that these sanctions are completely immoral. They're immoral based off the fact that we're taking a starving civilian population and contributing more to the starvation. And how we're doing that is these people are starving on the lower class, and it's part of Kim Jong-un's strategy to actually starve them. So these are people without food on their plate, and then we're putting sanctions on the whole entire population, and they have less food or no food. What Kim Jong-un is going to do is he's going to focus on his core class. He's not really going to worry about his hostile class. The second problem I have is that it plays right into the North Korean rhetoric. They'll claim to the hostile class that it's all external forces that are the reasons why they're starving. The North Korean regime will not say, hey, it's our fault as a government. They'll say it's external forces, and that it's the United States or the United Nations imposing these sanctions on them, and that it is these sanctions why they're suffering. And then the third reason is because they're ineffective. The goal of these sanctions is to create regime change. This regime change isn't happening, and it's not going to happen, and we have to face that reality. According to the Fragile States Index, which calculates the likelihood of all nations, it calculates the nation's stability, North Korea isn't even in the top 25. So we have to face the reality right now that the Kim Jong-un regime is here to stay for a long time if we don't do anything.
Any other panelists like to add?
I would like to. Go ahead.
So I agree with a lot of what you're saying. However, I think the first step that we need to take is to go back in time. So I'm a historian to an extent here, and I'm not in any way as good at politics and international relations as Jimmy is, but I think that what we need to do is go back to negotiations, and we need to go back to the fact again here, as I stated previously, that we don't have a peace treaty signed from the Korean War. That's caused a lot of tensions to arise, and no one really formally sat down and talked through what happened. I think talking through what happened and then going up to a negotiation today without any without anything at the beginning saying, well, we're going to talk, but first you needed to do X, Y, Z before we'll sit down and talk with you. If you go in there with an open mind from both sides, I think that being able to figure out where each side is coming from is going to get you farther than trying to set in a stipulation beforehand.
I would just like to make a comment on that, into the fact that in order to deter North Koreans from getting nuclear weapons, we have talked to them and we have tried diplomacy, as Jimmy had said, and even in 1994 we signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with North Korea. Only I think it was 2 years later for them to just completely walk away from it and continue to develop their nuclear weapons. Part of that treaty, we gave them billions of dollars in aid to try to get them to stop creating these nuclear weapons. We tried to negotiate, we tried to talk to them, and yet they still did not want to. They did not want to deal with us. They did for a time to get our aid, and then eventually they walked back on that agreement. So I don't know how much trying diplomacy, trying aid, and trying all those things are going to work in the future if we've already been shown that they haven't worked in the past.
Just to give an opposing viewpoint to this, I understand completely where Jimmy was coming from in that it is unfortunate that the lower class of North Korea suffers from economic sanctions. However, I would argue that economic sanctions are one of the most effective tools in the toolbox of international diplomacy to sort of deal with the problem that we see with North Korea. So according to education expert Elizabeth Helper, behavioral modifications can be used to increase desired behaviors in any individual or group regardless of functional level. We can see that behavioral modifications are in the form of economic sanctions, and I completely understand that this problem has been going on for quite some time, but if we look at continuing economic sanctions as well as coupling it with perhaps releasing the free internet to citizens of North Korea to sort of derail the regime in North Korea, we can see that we can try to solve this through diplomacy. I don't necessarily believe that going to war or military action right away without exploring further tactics is the best way to go about this.
I'm just kind of confused as to how we would get free internet into North Korea because of the extreme regulations that the government would impose on all of that. They don't allow their students, or they don't allow their citizens to have access to any sort of communication like that, or anything that might oppose their view. And yes, I agree that economic sanctions are very great in affecting international policy. However, we're not dealing with a standard international state. We're not dealing with a normal regime that we would in other cases. This is a regime where they completely and utterly control their people. They completely and utterly control what goes on inside their country. So if you impose economic sanctions on them, it won't affect the upper class because they're the one that's distributing the wealth to the people. They're distributing the food even. So if you impose those economic sanctions, the upper ruling class won't be affected by it because they'll just take it out on the lower class.
Alright, so with the releasing of the free internet, the fact that North Korea is so censored is exactly the reason why we need to create special forces that are dedicated to implementing this in North Korea. I'm not exactly sure the way we would go about it, however it could be done through special ops forces, I believe, so that would be something to consider as well.
To use special ops forces in North Korea would be hard because everybody's so monitored. The government has eyes everywhere, the government's listening everywhere, and one little slip up and you get sent to a work camp. So in order to have, if you want Western forces to do it, such as the United States, it'd be extremely hard to have anybody from the United States try to get into North Korea and do those things. It's hard enough for citizens to get out of North Korea, let alone for people to get into North Korea. And it's extremely hard to try to say anything opposing to the government or try to implement anything opposing to the government, even if you are doing clandestine operations or anything like that. North Korea is such a cut-off area where there's not normal routes in and out, there's not normal ways to spread communications or anything like that because it is so cut off.
I would just like to take a second to elaborate on a little bit of a point I made earlier, and it's the strategy of the Kim Jong-un regime to starve their people. And so why is this? And to the normal person, this won't make sense. When your people are starving, you want to revolt against your government, right? That would make sense. That would make logical sense. But here's the strategy, and the strategy is if you're starving your people enough, but you don't get them to the point where they're starving so much that they're willing to revolt against their government, and the Korean regime consistently keeps up their lower class in this kind of, I hate to use this term, sweet spot. But they keep on putting them in this position where they just feed them enough. So let's take it from a step of a member of the hostile class and a member of the lowest class and a member of the people that are starving. So for those that are starving, you either had the choice to rebel against your government, and whatever little food you have is now gone. And then you either had the choice to feed your family or to rebel against the government. And looking at that, it's not the question of why aren't these people rebelling, it's this question of why would they rebel?
Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, so we're going to pivot a little bit. The next question is, what obligations do we have towards South Korea, and how far does our relationship go with South Korea?
So I believe it was a couple months after the armistice was signed after the Korean War in 1953. The United States signed a mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Republic of Korea. And this agreement committed both nations to provide mutual aid if either faces external armed attacks. And it also allowed the United States to station military forces in South Korea. And the treaty signed says that the treaty shall remain indefinitely, and either party may terminate it, but it has to give 1 year's notice. So as far as concrete obligations to the Republic of Korea, that is our military obligation, that if they are attacked, we have to respond. And if we are attacked inversely, then they have to respond. And we are also kind of obligated to keep troops in South Korea in order to help protect them.
Going off of that, I definitely agree that it is extremely important to maintain the allyship and obligations that the United States has for South Korea. The United States always has an obligation to protect its allies to whatever extent it is able, especially with the treaty aforementioned. Additionally, considering the threat of North Korea, the United States only further bolsters intel and potential to respond by maintaining strong relationships with countries like South Korea and even Japan that are in close geographical proximity.
Sure, Jacob actually mentioned the mutual defense treaty, and there have been multiple times where that's been broken, and I'd like to touch on a couple of them. In March 2010, a South Korean corvette destroyer was sunk by North Korea, and there was only one plausible explanation, that was North Korea, and Pyongyang obviously denied any involvement in that. But then in November 2010, and this is one of the main things that I have a problem with, it's when North Korea shelled a South Korean border island, Yongbyon, and killed 4 South Koreans, including 2 civilians, and destroyed 70 homes. And that's directly an attack on South Korean soil. And so that's probably the instance where I have the largest problem with.
So then let's talk about war. So what do you think is the likelihood of the United States going to war with North Korea, and if so, what are the implications? Talk about sort of the positives and negatives of the situation.
So, new development that I found out this morning actually was that yesterday a North Korean soldier affected to defect out of North Korea. and while he was attempting to defect, he crossed a demilitarized zone and was shot at. By doing that, North Korea essentially broke the armistice agreement since they were shooting over the DMZ. As of right now, I do not personally know what's going on, but this could lead to something. If that does, I think that in the case of going to war, again, I'm going to fall back on my research from this summer. I looked into just war principles, and I think that's something we need to keep into mind is why are we going to go to war? What is our intention? And do we have the right? I think we do have the right, since we are an ally to South Korea, to get involved in this case, and considering everything that's been going on, if we do go into war, I think it could be for the best, but at the same time, depending on what actually happens, again, it may not be for the best. Since it's so early out, it's kind of hard to tell, definitely.
So I think to me, we talked about our obligations to South Korea and what those would be. And I think the better question is, what is our obligations to human rights? I think that America, we're founded on the principles that everybody has their own human rights, and it's not given to us by our government, it's given to us by the fact that we are human. And the amount of human rights atrocities that are going on in North Korea can't be underscored. Just the extreme amount of violence, the extreme amount of killing and torturing and just insane amount of human rights violations that are going on in North Korea calls for action. And we've already talked about how that diplomacy, giving aid, all these other things haven't worked. And in some cases have only led to even more human rights violations by the government. So on that, there's really not many options we have left other than to turn to war. You can speak on the fact that we continually put more troops in South Korea. We continually send more Navy ships over to that region. We're deploying more missile defense systems than ever. We're deploying more aircraft in different regions. So as far as if we're going to war, obviously we can't be say for certain or not, but it certainly appears that we're preparing for war in at least a small sense. Now, the negatives of war is what the negatives of war always will be, is that people will die. That's never going to change. That's what happens in war, is people die. However, if we don't go to war, people are still going to continue to die. But if we don't go to war, people will indefinitely be, or inevitably just continue to die forever as long as the regime keeps in power. Or if we do go to war, there's a possibility that after that war, the death will stop in Korea. That if we beat the regime, if we stop these atrocities, that eventually there could be peace. With war, that seems to be the only option right now, as to eventually find peace someday.
So, examining the positives and negatives of going to war and not going to war, based on many estimates gleaned, the United States would undoubtedly win. This would be, of course, at the cost of lives, but this happens with any war, and it's currently happening in North Korea, as previously mentioned. Another concern, specifically with going to war with North Korea that I have, is what would happen to the remaining North Korean citizens. Would there be a rebuilding effort to help aid the country in becoming more democratic? Would there be humanitarian aid available to these citizens? I think since the United States lacks a policy or plan set in place in regards to this, I'd like to see that pushed forward before there were any kind of official declaration.
To provide an example, I would like to use the Iraq War, and what the Iraq War kind of essentially what happened was it was a unilateral United States action, and it was involved with the United States, the UK, Australia, and Poland, and that was the invasion phase. Then after the invasion phase came the UN phase, and then the UN phase involved an unbelievable amount of support from all other nations. So when we're talking about rebuilding here, I think it's really important to use that example, and I think that same example could very well be used for the North Korean case. And in addition to that, the Iraqis didn't have a border with a democracy that could actually help them, and the North Koreans have that case with South Korea, and they could help them democratize and help all the refugee crisis that's going on.
I'm
I'd
sorry.
like to, go ahead. I'd like to bring up some other concerns I have about the potential war with North Korea. First of all, I don't see that we have a solid long-term plan for the region. Once we take out the Kim regime and attempt to unify Korea, which we don't really have a great record of toppling dictators and putting in democratic governments if you study CIA history. And so once we do that, we're going to have to fight China for dominance in this, but probably not militarily because neither country wants to fight that. But China does not want a unified Korea friendly to the US on its border, and they also don't want. China has also expressed concerns about the US invading North Korea because of the amount of refugees that would flood to its borders. And that China knows that once we topple this regime, we're going to go in and try to convert it to a US ally. We're basically going to double the size of South Korea. It'll be twice as strong and twice a threat to them. And going back to what I said earlier, if North Korea does have a functional ICBM, they would undoubtedly use it in their defense. And the missile defense system responsible for defending the North American homeland, which is called Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, short, or GMD for short, has a 55% success rate since 1999. So when we invade North Korea, we run the risk of DC or a large population center being nuked, and we essentially have a coin flip chance of stopping it.
I just want to clarify that one missile defense system is only one of our layers of protection. That we also have, as many of you heard in the news, we have THAAD missile defense system stationed in Hawaii that would also be prepared to intercept missiles. And we have other different missile intercept systems stationed on ships and on the homeland. So, but again, going on what he said is none of these systems have ever faced an actual missile in wartime. All these systems are untested, thankfully, because that means no one has shot a missile at us yet. But going on that, they still haven't been tested. So there is a risk. And speaking to Dakota's question from earlier, I don't think we're going to see a plan for rehabilitation of North Korea from especially not from the White House, because if we put out a plan for helping North Korea after we invade, that kind of tips our hand that we're invading. And so I don't think that we necessarily can say that at this time. However, I don't think that we're going to go and invade a country and leave it in ruins. There would have to be a lot of amount of aid. There would have to be a lot of amount of different, even clandestine operations to root out different people who are still loyal to the regime currently in there. And there'd also have to be an entire section, an entire force dedicated to re-assimilating the North Korean people into the 21st century. Building infrastructure, building telecommunications, and building an education system that is not just devoted to the regime, but devoted to actually finding the truth about world history, about different countries, and about what actually is going on in the world.
I would actually like to make a comparison. Maybe it's a crazy comparison, maybe I'm totally wrong, but I would like to compare the North Korean regime now to the Imperial Japanese regime, and that they view their leader as a god. Emperor Hirohito was viewed as God. Kim Jong-un right now viewed as God, and what the United States did with that, and Eric kind of said we don't really have the best track record when we make countries into a democracy. Well, Japan was a system where it worked. And it worked because we used Emperor Hirohito, and he came out and he said, I'm a man, not a god. And I think when that happened, you saw and being able to work with these gods of their nation, I think is very important. And I think if we were able to work with Kim Jong-un, that could be debated here or there, whether that could work, but if we could do that, then we could have a very similar case as we did with Japan, and now Japan is one of our best allies in the Pacific.
Okay, so we're gonna move forward then. So the next question is, should we pressure China to cut ties with North Korea? And if so, how?
So interestingly enough, slowly but surely, China has already been making its own steps to sever ties with North Korea. As stated by one of China's leading intellectual experts, quote, "We must see clearly that China and North Korea are no longer brothers in arms, and in the short term, there's no possibility of an improvement in Chinese-North Korean relations, given the current tension that we experience worldwide with North Korea." So by several measures, Chinese leaders have become more willing to get tough with North Korea and sever ties. I think that ultimately, if the United States were to try to intervene and expedite the process, it would only worsen it. It's already in the process of happening, and these sentiments are continuing to rapidly develop. So China itself will cut ties with North Korea. I don't believe that the United States needs to pressure it further.
I completely agree. I think China is starting to make a pivot away from North Korea. One, I mean, they helped pass the UN sanctions against North Korea this last round, in which they have banned some exports of petroleum and other products such as iron, and also stopped importing textile materials from North Korea, which has served as seeing that China is one of the only places that trades with North Korea has been pretty devastating to their economy. The trade going into North Korea has, or going from North Korea to China has started to decrease, and we've seen that, so these sanctions are, going into effect. China is playing along. I think part of this has to do with China wanting to become more of a regional hegemon. They want to have more power in the region, and they see that North Korea, having a crazy dictator, having a nuclear weapon, probably isn't good for stabilization in the region. So I don't think that the United States really needs to pressure too much China to move away from North Korea, because, as Dakota said, I believe that China is starting to make that pivot and go away from North Korea.
Okay, last question. How do you feel about President Trump's strategy towards North Korea? I'd like to open this up to all the panelists.
I think at its face value, and I think we shouldn't look at it as face value. At its face value, you have a president that's pretty much insulting another leader, and a very, very powerful leader. And that's not okay, but he's not operating under face value. And what he is operating under is actually he's moving towards war. And it's very hard to see this, and I totally agree, and it takes a lot to see this, but he's been stationing his military in the Pacific, and more importantly, very, very close to North Korea. And the 7th Fleet is currently stationed in South Korea, which is one of the largest Navy fleets that the United States has. And currently there are 35,000 troops in Korea and 40,000 in Japan. And this number has been growing ever since Trump took office. So it takes a very, very keen eye to see what is happening, but it appears as if he's on the path that we've been talking about, the path to war.
There was a great article I read in Times that really summed up President Trump's strategy in dealing with North Korea. So, in speech and through Twitter, he is escalating a conflict and trumpeting military options as he insists on a goal of denuclearization that is unachievable, a tactic of Chinese pressure that is unrealistic, and a premise of regime fragility that is wishful thinking. That's how war happens. So, as Jimmy stated, President Trump definitely is moving toward the path to war with North Korea. But I think by further giving North Korea this type of attention, especially through social media, we're only pushing them further into a defense mode, and this only escalates tension on both sides to the detriment of the United States.
I really dislike Trump's policy. I agree with everybody. He's bolstering rhetoric. He's talking about war. And that's the last thing you want to do before you invade a country. Before you invade a country, especially with the invasion that would be needed to have against North Korea, you really kind of want to make it look like you're not going to invade so they can't prepare. It should be, I don't want to say surprise attack, but it really should be a surprise to the North Koreans that we're doing it. And if you keep bolstering, if you keep talking about war, if you keep insulting the leader, that's only going to pressure North Korea to develop their weapons faster, put more people in the military, and hide their weapons better so that we won't be able to find them and take them out as targets. And that is all things that are very detrimental to a successful invasion of North Korea. So if President Trump wants to have the U.S. foreign policy of an eventual war with North Korea and an invasion of North Korea. The actions he's taking right now are actually kind of detrimental to that plan.
Right. I'd like to also kind of throw in here, and I think it's been subtly stated by everyone on the panel that we're going down a very dangerous path. This can lead to an actual war, this can lead to a nuclear war, it's gonna lead to something that no one's gonna end up with a happy ending, in my opinion. And I'm gonna go back to what I said earlier, where I really think we need to go in with discussion that's not gonna have any preconditions. And I know that some people on the panel definitely don't agree with me on that, but I don't think that losing lives over something that, in my opinion, could potentially be talked out is the way to go.
Yeah, so as with all the panelists, Trump's rhetoric towards North Korea puts me on edge. Even though I know that the Constitution, the War Powers Act, and the UN Charter prevent him from taking unilateral action. But it seems like in recent weeks, both sides have recognized the hostility and the rhetoric, with Nikki Haley saying that North Korea was begging for war, and North Korea saying that the US is begging for war. So it looks like both sides are gearing up for a conflict that I personally believe doesn't have to happen right now, or maybe even in the near future. I feel like once the regime collapses, we don't have to invade to take out the regime, in my opinion. I think we could wait for it to collapse and then swoop in, but then we would have to deal with the tension with China and fight them for dominance in the region, which presents a different set of challenges.
Can mention a little bit about happy endings, and we have to face the unfortunate reality that there are no happy endings in this scenario. Either we do nothing, we do strategic patience, as the doctrine has been called, and then there's still massive human rights abuses. Or we do something and we go to war, and there's still deaths in war. So unfortunately, there are no happy endings here, and we kind of have to face that reality.
And on that note, I'd like to thank the panelists. And before we move into audience Q&A, I just want to give a quick plug for our social media. So if you want to stay updated, don't want to get a ton of calendar invites sent to you randomly, like the Center for Politics on Facebook, it's Ripon College Center for Politics and the People. You can also follow us on Twitter, Ripon College CPP, and we have a website, ripon.edu/CPP, where you can find archive footage of all of this. And so with that in mind, we're going to move into audience Q&A. If you have a question, speak it loudly. I will repeat it though for the camera to hear. And then let us know if you are directing it at a certain panelist or the panel as a whole.
So one of the main challenges to reunification is economic differences. The North is somewhere between 50 to 60 years economically behind the South. Without even having the destruction of a war, their economic level, if they were reunified, is like they just fought a war and lost. And they have no industry that would stand up to the free market. So how economically could you picture reunification going with or without war? And this is probably Jimmy and Kim in particular.
So the question is about how economically you could handle reunification.
Yeah, so I wrote one of my papers on the reunification of West Germany and East Germany, and I think that's pretty similar, although not the exact same. Unfortunately, to answer your question, it's not going to be easy, and it's probably going to be very, very difficult. And you know what? It's probably not going to be perfect at all. There are going to be some major flaws, and there still are major flaws within the German economy. So, how do you do this, and how do you combat this? Well, you need to set up industry within North Korea, and you need to, and that's easier said than done. I understand that. But yeah, you have to use their labor forces that you're now going to have massive labor. And the thing about North Korea is they have a lot of useful minerals up there. The thing about minerals is they also require a lot of labor to extract. So how do you do that? I think you utilize their mineral market, although I will acknowledge it's not going to be perfect.
And also to kind of answer your question as well, I really do not know lot about economics as a little precursor to what I'm about to say. But going back in time here, a little bit that I also wrote on my research this summer was about what happened in Korea post-World War II, because Korea was a colony of Japan at that time, and after everything was said and done during World War II, the United States stepped in, as did the Soviet Union, but on the side of the United States, we definitely underestimated the economy in that area and how the people of Korea were dependent on Japan and how that economic system worked, and it fell into economic chaos. So I think a thing that we definitely need to look into if we would be doing anything in that area is how their economy is set up before essentially jumping in, and then making sure that we just don't make the same errors that we did post-World War II.
Yeah, Willie.
Alright, I want to throw a little bit of a curveball at you. So we all agree that, and there's definite proof that North Korea has nuclear weapons. What are the odds that, because of sanctions and increased pressure on North Korea, that it becomes so desperate they sell one of their nuclear weapons or technologies to a non-nuclear state actor in exchange for anything they can get? And how would the United States react to that?
So the question is, what is the likelihood of North Korea selling nuclear reactors, and how would the United States react to that? Hypothetical question. That's all sum that one up.
I think if North Korea were to the point of desperation in which they wanted to sell one of their nuclear reactors, they would have already collapsed. So I don't know that there would necessarily be any kind of United States reaction on that. I think it would be very beneficial. The collapse of the regime is something that is definitely necessary given the current climate.
To put a little bit of reality into your question, the market for the black market, I should say, for nuclear byproducts is huge. You have an example of how the North Koreans were able to nuclearize, and it was actually interesting the way they were able to nuclearize one of the leaders in Pakistan, one of the nuclear leaders in Pakistan actually shared information and shared blueprints with them on how to develop a nuclear centrifuge. And this was also from the USSR as well. And so to put a little bit of reality to your question, yes, this is possible. But is it probable? Probably not.
Yeah, I agree with what Jimmy said. I don't think it's far-fetched at all for it to become desperate. Like, desperate enough for them to sell all their nuclear weapons. They have a history of dealing arms to other nations like Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. And those would probably be one of the targets you were talking about. And so they've sustained their weak economy by selling arms and through smuggling. So I don't think it's out of the question that they would sell a nuke if it got desperate enough.
Any other questions? Yeah, Austin.
Okay, my question is, do you think that the North Korean regime is close to failure or could fail in the near future? And if not, I mean, do you see it just continuing to proceed?
The question is, do you think the North Korean regime is close to failure?
So in my little spiel up here, I use the Fragile States Index, and like I said, it hasn't been on the index for 25, it has been in the top 25 for a while. And like I said, we have to face the reality that they're here staying. We have this kind of false hope. We kind of have this fallacy that the regime might collapse under somehow a miracle, but unfortunately, we have to face that reality that they're there to stay.
I think due to the extreme amount of loyalty that especially the upper class and military has towards the regime, the extreme amount of almost brainwashing that is undertaken, the people and everything, I think the North Korean people are willing to take a lot before failure, before they throw in the towel. So with regards to that, I don't think they're close to being defeated. I don't think they're close to trying to find something else just because of that loyalty, and that, their extreme loyalty to their regime, their leader especially, and how high they regard him. They're willing to sacrifice so much, just for the betterment of the regime, not necessarily the country.
So I'd like to mention a little bit of ancient history regarding why the Koreans may not trust us. In 1871, after the Civil War, when all countries were scrambling for colonies in the Far East in their imperialist endeavors, we sent gunboats into Korea, attacked their fort, and killed 350 Koreans and suffered 3 losses. 11 years later, we signed the Mutual Defense Treaty with Korea. That gave us commercial access, but also was a hedge against the Japanese beginning to expand. However, after the Philippine War, when we took Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, rather the Spanish-American War, we made a deal with Japan, the Taft-Katsura Treaty in 1905, where the Japanese recognized our rights to those 3 territories in exchange for us recognizing their right to Korea. So we just wrote off the Mutual Defense Treaty that we had signed with Korea. Also, in World War II, the Koreans fought against the Japanese on our side under the illusion, as were the Vietnamese, that they would be given their independence after the war. And of course they were not, due to the U.S. preventing a free and open election. And we divided the country and destroyed the North completely. 3 million Koreans were killed. We bombed their dams to flood their rice fields to starve them. And we bombed everything to oblivion, back to the Stone Age. Air Force pilots said there's nothing left to bomb here. That's why they do not trust us, why they want a nuclear weapon, not for offensive purposes. Comments?
Sure, you mentioned how it's the North Korean regime that doesn't trust us because of us filing a mutual defense treaty. Well, the mutual defense treaty is being violated today with the Republic of Korea, and we're doing nothing about it. So my question back to you would be, well, what's that still say about us? Are we the same country that we were 100 years ago, or have we progressed?
Okay, I'll answer that. We are the same country which does not respect any treaties, as we've proven with the indigenous of this country, over 400 treaties broken, and we do not recognize any of the international agreements, Geneva Conventions against war, against torture. We do not recognize the International Court of Justice. So that's my answer.
I think that's a pretty good answer, but the answer is why not start? Why not start abiding by treaties? Why not start doing things that are legitimate? Just because we haven't in the past doesn't mean we can't start now.
I saw a hand in the back. Is there another question?
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk now, for example, the prospect of war going to war, go to war with North Korea now. It is understood too that we're going to use only conventional weapons for the time being. We're facing a country with the kind of spirit of the Second World War Japan, which a lot of us have talked about this evening. Maybe North Korea right now does not have the abundance of resources that the Imperial Japan enjoyed. The indoctrination stayed the same, if not even more severe. So, what we want to expect right now is that they're going to fight all out. And it does not have to be a battlefield set-piece battle, something like that. It can be a very strained out guerrilla war. And I think we have not touched tonight about the problem of public opinion and public support back home, not to mention congressional support. If the war lasts too long, do you think that our people back here will keep saying yes to our conducts over there?
So I think on your first point about the North Korean people, and I think a big part of that is the fact that they don't necessarily know what's going on, and they also live in constant fear of their regime. I think that once there's a possibility of being liberated, I think once they fully understand what's going on, once, you know, part of the campaign, at least what I would think would be in a campaign, would be the education of the people. You know, we did it in World War II, where we dropped, you know, pamphlets highlighting information that the Nazi regime is doing. Once we do that, and people start seeing that, once they realize that, you know, the Americans are coming, and they might not be living under that regime anymore, they would be, well, at least you would hope that they would be less devout for their regime. They would be less they would be less willing to, you know, suffer so much for their regime, because they wouldn't have to live in fear anymore. They wouldn't have to worry about if they misspeak, they're going to get sent to a camp. So in regards to that, I think as the war progresses, it's going to get easier, actually, because more and more people will be liberated, more and more people will realize that there's a better life on the other side of this regime, and they don't have to live in fear anymore. On the home front, I don't think a lot of people necessarily know what's actually going on in North Korea. I think if a lot of people knew about the insane atrocities that are going on inside these camps, there would almost be no question as to we have to do something against it. However, no one likes long wars. We've kind of proven that with this war on terror right now, and everybody's sick and wants to get out of the Middle East. But if it's a war for a good cause, if it's a war for fighting for human rights, and if it's a war against, you know, a genocide and immense human rights violations, I think that the American people would be more willing to go longer. I think Congress would be more willing to go into war for a longer period of time, if at the end this genocide and these human rights violations will eventually be gone.
Yeah, to address the latter part of your question, I'm definitely in agreement, but if you look at the panel composed before you, you can see that everyone here has differing political ideologies, we're different genders, different ages, and almost I would argue that everyone actually on this panel agrees that something needs to be done about North Korea, whether that is taking military action, continuing economic sanctions, or something of that matter. We simply can't let this continue, because the threat of nuclear war is not only a threat to American citizens, but a threat to world sanctity. So I would say that Americans would agree that something needs to be done.
I want to first commend you. That was a great question. That was a really, really good question. And I kind of made the comparison to Hirohito and the Imperial Japan to North Korea today. And you're totally right. They're going to fight tooth and nail. But like Jacob kind of said, towards the end of the Second World War, but do keep in mind that this is a war that lasted a long time, as opposed to a North Korean war. But the thing you kind of have to notice about this is the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, also known as the SCAP, had a higher, General Douglas MacArthur, had higher approval ratings when he took power than Emperor Hirohito did towards the end. So once you educate these people, then they'll be so pro-democracy. But like you said, this war is going to be hard, grueling. I mean, I don't deny that it's going to be a hard, grueling war. And I think that was a great point you brought up.
Yes, Mr. Smith.
Jacob, as I hear you speak, it's eerily familiar with the rhetoric before the Iraq invasion in 2003. That the people will really come out, support us, that they want human rights. But when we invaded Iraq, nationalism certainly was a part of the resistance, and Al-Qaeda emerged. We're still in that country. When we went into Vietnam, we were hoping to provide democracy, and yet there was such a strong reaction. We got mired down in an Asian war. What's to prevent, if we take military action in the north, through aerial bombardment and an invasion, What's going to keep it from becoming an endless 10-year or more war that's going to result in guerrilla activity? Secondly, you mentioned that we have a commitment to protect South Korea. All the estimates are that in the first 20 minutes of a war with North Korea, they would still have enough firepower to kill about over 1 million people in Seoul, and they would do it with conventional weapons. Do we sacrifice millions of lives in South Korea to get into a protracted war in North Korea?
On your second point, I don't know,
Could
whether-
people hear the question? You want to repeat it?
Yeah, so the first part of the question was what's to prevent this from becoming another 10-year sort of Iraq-like situation. And the second part, not quite sure how you want to summarize that one.
The second part is that the North Koreans have made it very clear, and they have the ability, that in the first 20 minutes of an attack by us, they could take out over 1 million people in Seoul.
So speaking to your second question, I don't know where that report was, and I haven't read that. However, I don't doubt that they have firepower enough to take out Seoul. But with a planned invasion, with trying to keep it, quiet, like I said earlier, keep it secret, part of that would be strategic bombing before you actually invade. Now, yes, this isn't going to be 100%. Not every single weapon system the North Koreans have will be taken out, but a whole bunch of them will. A lot of them will. So whether I think that they're going to have enough firepower to, kill millions of South Koreans after we have the strategic bombing campaign, I really doubt it. I really do. And speaking to your first question, the invasion of Iraq was different because it wasn't like a North Iraq and a South Iraq. It wasn't like the South Iraq was going to help try to reunify the country. These are people, cut from the same cloth. It wouldn't be just America going in there either. It would be a unified front. There would be plenty of South Korean troops right there next to our U.S. troops, and probably a coalition of a few other countries from most likely the Anglosphere. And so having that, they probably they would be less likely to have insurgent groups. However, because of the hardcore belief in the regime, there will be holdouts. There will be people that you can't get with the strategic bombing. There will be other people who are so devout and so willing to do anything for this regime that they won't change. And that might be the case. And if that is the case, then you need to do clandestine operations. You need to continue to keep those presence in the region and try to get those people out. But you wouldn't need an occupying military force in there to do that, because the South Koreans would be there to help unify the country. So the South Koreans would be doing most of the occupying, and the United States would help with eradicating these little insurgent groups with our clandestine operations and other special forces to try to minimize those effects.
I think one of our largest problems in Iraq was not trying to deal with Saddam Hussein a little bit. Working with him, I think that's a large reason why the insurgency happened, because we killed Saddam Hussein. Well, we didn't kill them, but the Iraqi people killed them in 2005, and nobody wanted to work with him, and then the insurgency continued. If we work with Kim Jong-un, I think that's something that the insurgency could be quelled to an extent.
One last question? Yeah, in the back.
I was in North Korea 67 years ago, and I sure remember they were pounding on us. I wouldn't look forward with the idea of going against China and North Korea again with the technology they have developed already. We were fighting against them when we had the technology, and they were a bunch of farmers. So I don't look at it would be any more successful this time than we were last time. So we're looking at it from the point of view that we're going to win. Look at it from the point of view that we could lose. After all, we signed an armistice not because we were winning. We signed the armistice because we were losing.
First off, I want to thank you for your service. And I also want to say that our military from World War II in Korea has drastically changed over the Cold War. We have drastically increased our military, we've drastically increased our technology, we've drastically increased our defense systems in order to protect more, and our training, our sophisticated military techniques and machines and weapons there's a far more technological gap between the United States military of today and the Koreans of the 1950s.
I'll agree with you on that, but have you changed the temperature? It was 24 below zero when we were fighting. We were beat by the weather.
And I mean, in response to that, I mean, there's been a lot of technological changes and even equipment that soldiers wear. There's, different gear that soldiers wear in order to keep warm. We have different heating elements we can bring into regions. I think the two wars would be drastically different. I think the United States is far more prepared for a war than North Korea is. Where at the time of the Korean War, I think the playing was a little more even. Where now I think the United States has a drastic advantage in both technology and strategy, and our ability to have surveillance and our ability to even predict weather in order to get the soldiers the equipment that they need. Our logistical chains are drastically increased, so soldiers won't be stuck without winter gear, hopefully, because our logistics have increased so much. And I think all these facts contribute to the fact that the United States right now is far more prepared for war and ready for it than ever before.
All right, did you want to respond? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't really agree with any of that in all honesty. So many things can go wrong when you're out there. And again, I'm just gonna go back to my point of you really don't need, sorry guys. I wanna go back to my point here again of we don't need to get involved into something to the extent I think that we're kind of pushing it here tonight, that it's gonna go to a huge brawl essentially. I think we really need to go back to small steps here to kind of figure out what's going on again, go back to the basics, go back to talks and discussions and kind of figure it out. I'm gonna press my point in here that I don't think we need to get involved in another war and lose a whole bunch of people again.
Okay, I want to thank our panelists for participating today, taking time out of the busy college schedule. We have one last event. There we go. We have one last event. It's going to be on the 27th, which is a Monday, in here, same time, same place. We're going to be having an alum of Ripon College, Rick Scott, who is a retired Foreign Service officer, talking about U.S. aid and foreign policy. So if that's interesting to you, come here 4:30 on the 27th. Thanks.